Bleak House by Charles Dickens, Chapter 58, A Wintry Night and Day. Still impassive, as behooves its breeding, the deadlocked townhouse carries itself as usual toward the street of dismal grandeur. It is given out that my lady has gone down into Lincolnshire, but is expected to return presently. Rumor, busy overmuch, however, will not go down into Lincolnshire. It persists in flitting and chattering about town. It knows that that poor unfortunate man, Sir Leicester, has been sadly used. It hears, my dear child, all sorts of shocking things. It makes the world of 5 miles round quite merry. Not to know that there is something wrong at the deadlock is to augur yourself unknown. One of the peachy-cheeked charmers is already apprised of all the principal circumstances that will come out before the Lords on Sir Leicester's application for a bill of divorce. At feasts and festivals also, and firmaments she had often graced, and among constellations she outshone but yesterday, she is still the prevalent subject. What is it? Who is it? When was it? Where was it? How was it? She is discussed by her dear friends with all the genteelest slang in vogue, with the last new word, the last new manner, the last new drawl, and the perfection of polite indifference, and not the least amazing circumstances connected with her being vaguely. The town talk is that people who know nothing, and ever did know nothing, about her think it essential to their reputation to pretend that she is their topic too, and to retail her at second hand with the last new word, and the last new manner, and the last new drawl, and the last new polite indifference. So goes the wintry day outside the Dedlock mansion. How within it? Sir Leicester, lying in his bed, can speak a little, though with difficulty and indistinctness. He is enjoined in silence and to rest, and they have given him some opiate to lull his pain, for his old enemy is very loud with him. He is never asleep, though sometimes he seems to fall into a dull waking doze. He caused his bedstead to be moved out nearer to the window when they heard it. It was such inclement weather, and his head to be so adjusted that he could see the driving snow and sleet. He watches as it falls throughout the whole wintry day. Upon the least noise in the house, which is kept hushed, his hand is at the pencil. The old housekeeper sitting by him knows what he would write and whispers. "No, he has not come back yet, Sir Leicester. It was late last night when he went. He has been but a little time gone yet." He withdraws his hand and falls to looking at the sleet and snow again until they seem, by being long looked at, to fall so thick and fast that he is obliged to close his eyes for a minute on the giddy whirl of white flakes and icy blots. He began to look at them as soon as it was light. The day is not yet far spent when he conceives it to be necessary that her room should be prepared for her. It is very cold and wet. Let there be good fires. Let them know that she is expected. Please see to it yourself. He writes to this purpose on the slate, and Mrs. Rouncewell, with a heavy heart, obeys. "For I dread, George," the old lady says to her son, who waits below to keep her company when she has had a little leisure. "I dread, my dear, that my lady will never more set foot within these walls, nor yet within the walls of Chesney Wold, my dear." "That's worse, but why, mother?" "When I saw my lady yesterday, George, she looked at me, and I may say at me too. She looked to me, and I may say at me too, as if the step on the Ghost's Walk had almost walked her down." Come, you alarm yourself with old story fears, mother." "No, I don't, my dear, no, I don't. It's going on for 60 years that I have been in this family, and I never had any fears for it before. But it's breaking up, my dear. The great old Dedlock family is breaking up. I am thankful I have lived long enough to be with Sir Leicester in this illness and trouble, for I know I am not too old nor too useless to be a welcomer sight to him than anybody else in my place would be. but the step on the ghost's walk will walk my lady down. George, it has been many a day behind her, and now it will pass her and go on. Well, mother dear, I hope not. Ah, so do I, George, the old lady returns, shaking her head and parting her folded hands. But if my fears come true, and he has to know it, who will tell him? Are these her rooms? They are my lady's rooms, just as she left them. The old housekeeper and her son remain until the preparations are complete, and then she returns. Volumnia has taken Mrs. Rouncewell's place in the meantime. Volumnia, not being supposed to know, and indeed not knowing, what is the matter, has found it a ticklish task to offer appropriate observations. Yielding, therefore, the chair at the bedside to the quaint old housekeeper, Volumnia sits at a table a little removed, sympathetically sighing. Sir Leicester watches the sleet and snow, and listens for the returning steps that he expects. He has been under his valet's hands this morning to be made presentable, and is as well got up as the circumstances will allow. He is propped with pillows, his grey hair is brushed in its usual manner, his linen is arranged to a nicety, his eyeglass and his watch are ready to his hand. It is necessary, less to his own dignity now, perhaps, and for her sake, that he should be seen as little disturbed and as much himself as may be. Women will talk, and Volumnia, though a deadlock, is no exception. He keeps her here, there is little doubt, to prevent her talking somewhere else. He is very ill, but he makes his present stand against distress of mind and body most courageously. The fair Volumnia, being one of those sprightly girls who cannot long continue silent, compliments Mrs. Rouncewell on her son, declaring that he positively is one of the finest figures she has ever seen. Sir Leicester hears this tribute with so much surprise, and stares about him in such a confused way that Mrs. Rouncewell feels it necessary to explain. Miss Dedlock don't speak of my eldest son, Sir Leicester, but my youngest. I have found him. He has come home. Sir Leicester breaks silence with a harsh cry. George? Your son George come home, Mrs. Rouncewell? The old housekeeper wipes her eyes. Thank God, Sir Leicester. Does this discovery of someone lost, this return of someone so long gone, come upon him as a strong confirmation of his hopes? Does he think I shall not, with the aid I have, recall her safely after this? There being fewer hours in her case than there are years in his, it is of no use entreating him. He is determined to speak now, and he does, in a thick crowd of sounds, but still intelligibly enough to be understood. Why did you not tell me, Mrs. Rouncewell? It happened only yesterday, Sir Leicester, and I doubted your being well enough to be talked to of such things. Where is your son George, Mrs. Rouncewell? Asks Sir Leicester. Mrs. Rouncewell, still a little alarmed by his disregard of the doctor's injunctions, replies, in London. Where in London? Mrs. Rouncewell is constrained to admit that he is in the house. Bring him here in my room. Bring him directly. The old lady can do nothing but go search for him. Sir Leicester, with such power of movement as he has, arranges himself a little to receive him. When he has done so, he looks out again at the falling sleet and snow and listens again for the returning steps. A quantity of straw has been tumbled down in the street to deaden the noises there, and she might be driven to the door, perhaps without his hearing wheels. He is lying thus, apparently forgetful of his newer and minor surprise, when the housekeeper returns, accompanied by her trooper son. Mr. George approaches softly to the bedside, makes his bow, squares his chest, and stands with his face flushed, very heartily ashamed of himself. Good heaven, is that really George Rouncewell? Exclaims Sir Leicester. Do you remember me, George? I have a very bad memory indeed, Sir Leicester. I must have a very bad memory indeed, Sir Leicester, if I fail to remember you. When I look at you, George Rouncewell, Sir Leicester observes with difficulty. I see something of a boy at Chesney Wold, I remember well, very well. He looks at the trooper until tears come into his eyes, and he looks at the sleet and snow again. Ask your pardon, Sir Leicester, says the trooper, but would you accept of my arms to raise you up? You would lie easier, Sir Leicester, if you would allow me to move you. If you please, George Rouncewell, if you will be so good. The trooper takes him in his arms like a child, lightly raises him, and turns him with his face more toward the window. Thank you. You have your mother's gentleness, returns Sir Leicester, and your own strength. Thank you. He signs to him with his hand not to go away. George quietly remains at the bedside, waiting to be spoken to. Why did you wish for secrecy? Why did you wish for secrecy? Truly, I am not much to boast of, Sir Leicester, and I should still, Sir Leicester, if you was not so indisposed, which I hope you will not be long, I should still hope for favour of being allowed to remain unknown in general. That involves explanations not very creditable to myself. I should think it would be universally agreed, Sir Leicester, that I am not much to boast of. You have been a soldier, observed Sir Leicester, and a faithful one. George makes his military bow. As far as that goes, Sir Leicester, I have done my duty under discipline. You find me, says Sir Leicester, whose eyes are much attracted toward him, far from well, George Rouncewell. I am very sorry both to hear it and to see it, Sir Leicester. I am sure you are. No, in addition to my older malady, I have had a sudden and bad attack. Something that deadens, making an endeavor to pass one hand down one side, and confuses, touching his lips. George, with a look of assent and sympathy, makes another bow. The different times when they were both young men, the trooper much the younger of the two, and looked at one another down at Chesney Wold arise before them and soften both. Sir Leicester, evidently, with a great determination to say, in his own manner, something that is on his mind, before relapsing into silence, tries to raise himself among his pillows a little more. George observes of the action, takes him in his arms again, and places him as he desires to be. Thank you, George. You are another self to me. You have often carried my spare gun at Chesney Wold, George. You are familiar to me in these strange circumstances, very familiar. He has put Sir Leicester's sounder arm over his shoulder in lifting him up, and Sir Leicester is slow in drawing it away again as he says these words. I am about to add, he presently goes on, I was about to add respecting this attack, that it was unfortunately simultaneous with a slight misunderstanding between my lady and myself. I do not mean there was any difference between us, for there has been none. But there was a misunderstanding of certain circumstances important only to ourselves, which deprives me for a little while of my lady's society. She has found it necessary to make a journey I trust will shortly return. Volumina. Do I make myself intelligible? The words are not quite under my command. Volumnia understands him perfectly, and in truth he delivers himself with far greater plainness than could have been supposed possible a minute ago. The effort by which he does so is written in the anxious and laboring expression of his face. Nothing but the strength of his purpose enables him to make it. Therefore, Volumnia, I desire to say in your presence and in presence of my old retainer and friend, Mrs. Rouncewell, whose truth and fidelity no one can question, and in the presence of her son,
George, who comes back like a familiar recollection of my youth in the home of my ancestors at Chesney Wold, in case I should relapse, in case I should not recover, in case I should lose both my speech and the power of writing, though I hope for better things.
The old housekeeper weeping silently, Volumnia in greatest agitation, with the freshest plume on her cheeks, the trooper with his arms folded and his head a little bent, respectfully attentive.
Therefore I desire to say, and to call you all to witness, beginning, Volumnia, with yourself most solemnly, that I am on unaltered terms with Lady Dedlock, that I assert no cause whatever of complaint against her, that I have ever had the strongest affection for her, and that I retain it undiminished. Say this to herself and to everyone. If you ever say less than this, you will be guilty of deliberate falsehood to me.
Volumnia tremblingly protests that she will observe his injunctions to the letter. His injunctions to the letter.
My lady is too high in position, too handsome, too accomplished, too superior in most respects to the best of those by whom she is surrounded, not to have her enemies and traducers, I dare say, let it be known to them, as I make it known to you, that being of sound mind, memory, and understanding, I revoke no disposition I have made in her favor. I abridge nothing I have ever bestowed upon her. I am on unaltered terms with her, and I recall having the full power to do, if I were disposed, as you see, no act I have done for her advantage and happiness.
His formal array of words may have at any other time, as it is often said, something ludicrous in it, but at this time it is serious and affecting. His noble earnestness, his fidelity, his gallant shielding of her, his generous conquest of his own wrong, and his own pride for her sake, are simply honorable, manly, and true. Overpowered by his exertions, he lays his head back on his pillows and closes his eyes for not more than a minute, when he again resumes his watching of the weather and his attention to the muffled sounds and the rendering of those little services, and in the manner of their acceptance. The trooper has become installed as necessary to him. Nothing has been said, but it is quite understood. The day is now beginning to decline. The mist and the sleet, into which the snow has all resolved itself, are darker, and the blaze begins to tell more vividly upon the room, walls, and furniture. The gloom augments. The bright gas springs up in the streets, and the pertinacious oil lamps, which yet hold their ground there, twinkle gaspingly, like fiery fish out of water as they are. The world, which has been rumbling over the straw and pulling at the bell to inquire, begins to go home, begins to dress, to dine, to discuss its dear friend with all the last new modes. Nor does Sir Leicester become worse, restless, uneasy, in great pain. Volumnia, lighting a candle, is bidden to put it out again, for it is not yet dark enough. Yet it is very dark too, as dark as it will be all night. By and by she tries again. No, put it out, it is not dark enough yet. His old housekeeper is the first to understand that he is striving to uphold the fiction with himself, that it is not growing late.
Dear Sir Leicester, my honoured master, she softly whispers, I must for your own good and my duty take the freedom of begging and praying that you will not lie here in the lone darkness, watching and waiting and dragging through the time. Let me draw the curtains, the light, the candles, and make things more comfortable about you. The church clocks will strike the hours just the same, Sir Leicester, and the night will pass away just the same. My lady will come back just the same.
I know it, Mrs. Rouncewell, but I am weak, and she has been so long gone.
Not so long gone, Sir Leicester, not 24 hours yet.
But that is a long time. Oh, it is a long time.
He says it with a groan that wrings her heart. She knows that this is not a period for bringing the rough light upon him. She thinks his tears too sacred to be seen, even by her. Therefore she sits in the darkness for a while without a word. then gently begins to move about. Finally, he tells her, with recovered self-command,
As you say, Mrs. Rouncewell, this is no worse. For being confessed, it is getting late, and they are not come. Light the room.
When it is lighted, and the weather shut out, it is only left to him to listen. But they find that however dejected and ill he is, he brightens when a quiet pretense is made of looking at the furs in her room and being sure that everything is ready to receive her. Poor pretense as it is, these allusions to her being expected to keep up hope within him. Midnight comes, and with it the same blank. The carriages in the streets are few. The other late sounds of the neighborhood there are none. Upon this wintry night it is so still that listening to the intense silence is like looking at intense darkness. The corporation of servants are dismissed to bed, not unwilling to go, for they were up all last night, and only Mrs. Rouncewell and George keep watch in Sir Leicester's room, as the night lags tardily on, or rather, when it seems to stop altogether. At between 2 and 3 o'clock, they find a restless craving on him to know more about the weather now. He cannot see it. Hence George, patrolling regularly every half hour to the rooms so carefully looked after, extends his march to the hall door, looks about him, and brings back the best report he can make of the worst of nights. The sleet still falling, and even the stone footways lying ankle-deep in icy sludge. There is no improvement in the weather. From the portico, from the eaves, from the parapet, from every ledge and post and pillar drips the thawed snow. It has crept, as if for shelter, into the lintels of the great door, under it, into the corners of the windows, into every chink and crevice of retreat. And there wastes and dies. It is falling still upon the roof, upon the skylight, even through the skylight, and drip, drip, drip with the regularity of the ghost's walk on the stone floor below.
All is still in readiness, George Rouncewell.
Quite orderly and right, Sir Leicester.
No word of any kind. The trooper shakes his head. No letter that can possibly have been overlooked.
But he knows there is no such hope, and lays his head down without looking for an answer. And that is the end of chapter 58.